In a small French chateau, in the spring of 1519, an old man lay dying. His right hand was partly paralyzed. His eyes, which had once seen more clearly than almost anyone who ever lived, were beginning to fail. Around him were notebooks. Thousands and thousands of pages packed with drawings of machines that would not be built for 400 years, studies of the human heart that would not be confirmed until the 20th century, sketches of birds in flight, water in motion, and faces caught mid-laugh. Most of his great projects were unfinished. The giant bronze horse he had promised a duke was never cast. The fresco he painted in Florence had already begun to peel off the wall. The flying machine never flew. By the standard measure of a working life, this man had failed at most of what he set out to do. And yet 500 years later, we still say his name when we want to describe the highest reach of human ability. We call a certain kind of person a Renaissance man, and we are usually thinking of him whether we know it or not. His name was Leonardo da Vinci, and the gap between what he attempted and what he completed is exactly what makes his story worth telling. If you are enjoying this so far, hit like and subscribe. It honestly helps the channel more than you would guess. And here is a question I want you to sit with as we go. Imagine you are a young apprentice in a Florence workshop around 1470, and the strange left-handed boy next to you keeps cutting open dead animals to see how the muscles work. Would you have thought he was a genius, or would you have thought he was wasting everyone's time? Drop your answer in the comments. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to follow Leonardo from a hillside village in Tuscany to the courts of dukes and kings. We will look at how an illegitimate boy with no university education became the most curious mind of his age. We will dig into the paintings, yes, but also the dissections, the war machines, the canals, the obsessions, and the long stretches where he seemed to do nothing at all. This is not a story about a man who knew he was a genius and acted accordingly. It is the story of someone who could not stop asking why, and who paid for that curiosity in unfinished work, lost commissions, and a reputation in his own lifetime for being unreliable. Let us start at the beginning. In the place that gave him his name, the boy from Vinci. Leonardo was born on the 15th of April, 1452, near the town of Vinci, in the hills west of Florence. We even know the hour, because his grandfather wrote it down. The note records that a grandson was born to his son Piero at the 3rd hour of the night, which in the timekeeping of the day put the birth at around 10:30 in the evening. The grandfather added the names of the people who came to the baptism. It is a small, ordinary family record. Nobody writing it had any idea what the child would become. The full name was Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci. That is worth unpacking, because in the 15th century, a name carried a person's whole social position. The word Sir in front of Piero meant that Leonardo's father was a notary, a respectable professional who drew up legal documents and contracts. Da Vinci simply meant from Vinci. It was not a surname in the modern sense. It told you where the family came from. So Leonardo's name, translated plainly, means Leonardo, son of Master Piero, from Vinci. There was a complication built into that name from the start. Leonardo was illegitimate. His father, Piero, was a young notary on his way up in the world. His mother was a woman named Caterina, whose exact background has been argued over for centuries. For a long time, she was assumed to be a local peasant girl. More recent research has suggested she may have been an enslaved woman, possibly from the region around the Black Sea or the Middle East, brought to Tuscany through the slave trade that ran through the Mediterranean at the time. The evidence is not settled, and historians still disagree. What is certain is that Piero and Caterina were not married, and never would be. This mattered enormously. In Renaissance Italy, being born outside marriage closed certain doors permanently. Leonardo could not inherit in the normal way. More importantly for his future, He was barred from the respectable professions that required guild membership and formal study. He could not become a notary like his father. He could not enter a university to study law or medicine or theology. The whole track of book learning in Latin, which was the gateway to status and to the learned professions, was effectively shut to him. It is one of the strangest facts about Leonardo that his illegitimacy may have been the making of him. Because he was not slotted into the family trade, he was free. Free to be sent in a different direction, free to follow his own eye, and free, eventually, to spend his days drawing and dissecting and asking questions that a respectable notary would never have had time for. He would later describe himself, with a touch of pride, as uomo senza lettere, a man without letters, meaning a man without formal scholarly education. He meant it partly as a complaint about how the scholars looked down on him, but he also meant it as a boast. He had learned from experience, from looking, not from old books, and he thought that made his knowledge more reliable. Soon after Leonardo's birth, the lives of both parents moved on without him. His father Piero married a young woman of suitable family, the first of 4 wives over his long life. His mother Caterina was married off to a local man, a kiln worker known by a nickname that roughly translates as the Quarreler. Leonardo grew up partly in his father's household and partly with his grandfather and an uncle named Francesco, who seems to have had little interest in business and a great deal of interest in the countryside. That uncle may well have been the person who first walked the young Leonardo through the olive groves and along the streams, showing him how to actually look at the natural world. Vinci itself was tiny, a cluster of stone houses around a small castle, surrounded by terraced hillsides of olives and vines. Below ran the Arno Valley, above rose Monte Albano. It was the kind of place where a curious child had nothing to do but observe. Leonardo's later notebooks are full of memories that seem to reach back to this landscape. He wrote about the way water moves, the shape of flight, the layering of rocks. He once described, in a famous passage, walking up to the mouth of a dark cave in the hills, torn between 2 feelings. He was afraid of the threatening darkness inside, and at the same time he was desperate to know whether there was something marvelous within. That tension, fear pulling one way and curiosity pulling harder the other way, is as good a description of his whole life as anyone has ever written, and he wrote it about himself. We do not have a detailed record of his early schooling. He likely learned to read and write in Italian, picked up some arithmetic of the practical commercial kind that Florentine boys were taught, and absorbed nothing of the formal Latin grammar that defined an educated man. He was left-handed, and he wrote, throughout his life, in a peculiar mirror script that ran from right to left, with each letter reversed. Hold one of his pages up to a glass, and it reads normally. Why he did this has been debated endlessly. The simplest explanation is that he was left-handed, and writing right to left meant his hand did not drag through the wet ink. There may have been an element of privacy too, a way of keeping casual readers out of his notes, but the mirror writing was not really a secret code. It was just easier for him. Here is a small thing that tells you something about how observant he was, even as a child. In one of his notebooks, decades later, he described a particular kind of bird, a kite, that he said had come to him in his cradle when he was an infant. He recalled, or imagined, the bird opening his mouth with its tail and striking him on the lips. He wrote this down as a real memory. Whether it happened or not, the point is that for Leonardo, the world of birds and flight was tangled up with his earliest sense of himself, and it would stay with him until the day he died, still trying to understand how a wing pushes against air. By the time he was a teenager, it was clear to his father that the boy had a gift. Leonardo could draw, not in the careful, dutiful way that any apprentice might learn, but with a fluency that startled people. The story goes that Piero collected some of his son's drawings and took them to a friend in Florence, a respected artist who ran a busy workshop. The friend looked at the work and told Piero that the boy must be trained properly. And so, sometime in his middle teens, Leonardo left the hills of Vinci and went down into the city that was about to become the most exciting place in Europe, Florence, and the workshop of Verrocchio. To understand what happened next, you have to understand Florence in the 1460s and 70s. It was not a large city by modern standards, perhaps 50,000 people, but it was rich, ambitious, and crackling with energy. Its wealth came from banking and the wool and silk trades. Its politics were dominated, behind a republican facade, by one family, the Medici, whose bank had branches across Europe and whose money flowed into art, building, and scholarship. The city was in the middle of what we now call the Renaissance, a rebirth of interest in the art, learning, and ideas of ancient Greece and Rome, combined with new techniques and a new confidence in what human beings could achieve. For an artistically gifted young man with no university prospects, Florence was the best possible destination. Art was not yet considered one of the noble pursuits. A painter or sculptor was a craftsman, a member of a guild, someone who ran a business and took commissions, but it was a respectable, even prestigious trade for a talented person of modest birth, and the workshops of Florence were where that trade was learned. Leonardo was placed in the workshop, the bottega, of Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was one of the leading artists of the city, a sculptor, painter, goldsmith, and engineer all at once. His workshop was less like an art studio in the modern romantic sense, and more like a small manufacturing firm. It produced everything. Painted panels and altarpieces, yes, but also bronze sculptures, tomb monuments, decorative metalwork, festival props, suits of parade armor, and engineering solutions for the city's grand projects. An apprentice in that environment did not specialize. He learned to grind and mix pigments, to prepare wooden panels, to cast bronze, to work gold, to draw from life, to understand perspective and proportion, and to solve practical mechanical problems. This is the crucial point about Leonardo's training. He never went to university, and he never stopped resenting the scholars who did. But the workshop gave him something a university could not. It taught him to combine the hand and the eye and the mind, to treat art and engineering and science as one continuous activity. The boundary we draw between an artist and an inventor and a scientist would have made no sense to Verrocchio or his apprentices. To make a convincing painting of a draped figure, you had to understand how cloth falls, which meant understanding weight and gravity. To cast a bronze, you had to understand metals and heat and the mechanics of moving heavy objects. To paint a landscape with real depth, you had to understand optics and the way the atmosphere changes color over distance. All of it was connected, and Leonardo, more than anyone before or since, refused to stop pulling on the connections. There is one more thing the workshop gave Leonardo that is easy to overlook, and it concerns the actual material of painting. When Leonardo was young, the dominant technique for panel painting in Italy was tempera, in which pigment is bound with egg yolk. Tempera dries fast and produces bright, flat, opaque color, but it is unforgiving and hard to blend, because it sets almost as soon as it touches the surface. Around this time, a different method was spreading south from the painters of the Low Countries, in what is now Belgium and the Netherlands. They had perfected oil painting, grinding their pigments into slow-drying oils. Oil paint stays workable for hours or days. It can be built up in thin, translucent layers, blended softly, and reworked endlessly, and it allows deep, glowing shadows and subtle transitions impossible in tempera. For a slow, perfectionist, endlessly adjusting artist like Leonardo, oil paint was close to a perfect medium, and he became one of its great early masters in Italy. Almost everything that makes his painting distinctive, the soft edges, the deep shadow, the sense of real air and light, depends on the patient layering that oil paint made possible. The arrival of this new material and the arrival of Leonardo's particular gift happened to coincide, and he seized on it. He arrived as a teenager and stayed in or around the workshop into his middle 20s. By 1472, at the age of 20, his name was entered in the register of the Painters' Guild of Florence, the Compagnia di San Luca. He was now a qualified master in his own right, free to take commissions independently. But he did not leave Verrocchio immediately. He kept working in and with the workshop for years, which was common. A young master often stayed on, contributing to the shop's projects while building his own reputation. There is a famous story from this period that, even if it has been embroidered over the centuries, captures something real. Verrocchio was painting a picture of the baptism of Christ. As was normal practice, he had assistants work on parts of it. Leonardo was given an angel to paint in the lower left corner, and possibly some of the background landscape. When the picture was finished, Leonardo's angel was so much more delicate, so much more alive, so much better than the rest of the painting, that according to the story, Verrocchio was stunned. The 16th century writer Giorgio Vasari, who collected biographies of artists, claimed that Verrocchio was so dismayed at being surpassed by a boy that he gave up painting altogether and stuck to sculpture for the rest of his life. We should be careful with that story. Vasari wrote decades later and loved a good dramatic anecdote. Verrocchio did keep working. But if you stand in front of that painting today, in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the difference really is visible. The kneeling angel that scholars attribute to Leonardo has a softness and a turn of the head, a sense of a real person caught in a real moment, that the stiffer figures around it do not. Even at the start, his work has a quality that is hard to name and impossible to miss. He was painting people who seemed to breathe. This is the right point to pause and look at the world Leonardo was now living in, because the texture of daily life in Renaissance, Florence, shaped everything he did. Society was layered with a precision that everyone understood. At the top sat the great merchant and banking families, the Medici above all, who dressed in heavy silks and brocades, dyed in expensive colors, deep crimson, rich blue, and black, which was costly to produce well. The wealthy lived in stone palaces, with interior courtyards, and ate elaborately, with meat, imported spices, sugar sculptures at banquets, and wine. Below them came the comfortable class of established guild masters, professionals, and prosperous shopkeepers, people like Leonardo's notary father, who wore good wool, ate well enough, and held respectable civic positions. Beneath them were the ordinary craftsmen and laborers, the wool carters and dyers and porters who actually made the city's wealth, who wore plain, undyed or cheaply dyed clothing, ate bread, beans, vegetables, and only occasionally meat, and lived in crowded quarters. At the bottom were the truly poor and the enslaved, for slavery did exist in the Italian cities, mostly women working as household servants. Sumptuary laws tried to regulate who could wear what, taxing or banning excessive finery on lower ranks, precisely because clothing was a public signal of where you stood. A man's collar, the cut of his cloak, the color of his hose, all announced his place before he opened his mouth. Leonardo, as it happens, loved fine clothing and dressed strikingly in colorful tunics and, by some accounts, rose-pink cloaks cut shorter than was usual, which raised eyebrows. For a man of his origins, dressing like that was a small daily act of self-assertion. In 1476, when Leonardo was 24, something happened that could have ended his career, or even his life. An anonymous accusation was dropped into one of the city's tamburi, the drum-shaped boxes where Florentines could leave secret denunciations of their neighbors. The accusation charged several young men, Leonardo among them, with sodomy, which was a serious crime under Florentine law. The case was investigated and then dismissed, apparently for lack of corroborating witnesses, and the matter was dropped. We do not know the full truth behind it. What we do know is that Leonardo never married, left no record of any romantic relationship with a woman, and surrounded himself for most of his life with younger male assistants and companions. Many historians believe he was homosexual. Others caution that the evidence is thin and circumstantial. Either way, the episode in 1476 was a frightening brush with a legal system that could be brutal, and it may have deepened a certain wariness in him, a tendency to keep his private life private and his notebooks turned away from prying eyes. Through these Florence years, he was building a reputation, but also beginning to show the trait that would shadow his entire life. He started things and did not finish them. He received a commission for an altarpiece and never delivered the final work. He was hired, along with other artists, to consider a project and then drifted away from it. The most important example was a painting called The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned by monks near Florence around 1481. Leonardo threw himself into it. He produced extraordinary preliminary drawings, a swirling, dynamic composition full of agitated figures crowding around the infant Christ, with strange ruined architecture and rearing horses in the background. It was unlike anything anyone had attempted, and then he abandoned it, leaving only the brown underpainting, the ghost of a masterpiece. You can see it today, unfinished, and it is somehow more haunting for being incomplete. We can sense the picture he was reaching for, and we can sense the moment he walked away. Why did he walk away? Because at around the age of 30, Leonardo made a decision that would change the shape of his life. He left Florence. He left the city of his training, the center of the art world, and he went north to Milan to offer his services to one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Italy, the first masterworks. Before we follow Leonardo north, we should look closely at the paintings he made in Florence in his 20s and early 30s, because they already contain everything that would make him famous. In seed form, these early works are less known than the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper, but they are where you can watch a young artist quietly tear up the rule book. One of the earliest things we can confidently attribute to him on his own is a small painting of the Annunciation, the moment the angel Gabriel tells Mary she will bear a child. It is a traditional subject, but Leonardo treated it with a naturalist's eye. He gave the angel real wings, and there is a story, possibly later invention, that he modeled them on the wings of actual birds, rather than the conventional decorative feathers other painters used. The garden, the plants, the folds of the drapery, all of it is observed rather than copied from formula. A young man is already insisting that a painted world should obey the rules of the real one. Then there is the portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, a young Florentine woman, painted around 1474. It is one of the earliest known portraits to turn the sitter toward the viewer, rather than showing her in flat profile, decades before he would perfect that idea in the Mona Lisa. Behind Ginevra, he painted a spiky juniper bush, a visual pun on her name, since the Italian word for juniper sounds like her name. Her face is pale, still, and slightly melancholy, and the surface has the soft, smoky handling that would become his signature. This single portrait now hangs in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and it is the only painting by Leonardo on public display in the entire Western Hemisphere, which gives you a sense of how rare his finished works are. He also painted intimate religious scenes of the Madonna and Child that broke with the stiff, symmetrical tradition. In a small work known as the Benoit Madonna, he showed Mary as a young, almost girlish mother, smiling and playing with her baby as he reaches for a flower, the two of them caught in a natural, tender, slightly awkward human moment rather than posed like holy statues. It looks like a real mother with a real squirming infant. That was new. Religious figures were supposed to be solemn and remote. Leonardo made them human, and other artists noticed and began to imitate the approach. And then there is Saint Jerome, which is the most revealing of all, because it is unfinished. and being unfinished, it shows us exactly how Leonardo's mind worked. It depicts the old hermit saint kneeling in the wilderness, gaunt and twisted with penance, a lion at his feet. Even half-painted, the figure has an anatomical intensity that is almost shocking. You can see the muscles and tendons of the saint's neck and shoulder rendered with the precision of a dissection, because by this point, Leonardo was already studying anatomy. The painting was never completed, abandoned like so much else, and it had an extraordinary afterlife. By one account, it was lost for centuries, then rediscovered in pieces, with the section containing the saint's head supposedly found being used as the seat of a stool in a junk shop, and another part found elsewhere. The fragments eventually reunited. Whether every detail of that story is true, the painting survives, unfinished, in the Vatican, and it is one of the clearest windows we have into how he built a figure from the bone outward. These early Florentine works tell us that the revolution did not begin with the famous masterpieces. By the time Leonardo left for Milan, he had already invented his approach. The turn toward the viewer, the smoky modeling, the human warmth in sacred scenes, the anatomical truth beneath the skin, and the fatal tendency to leave the work undone. All of it was present before he was 35. What he lacked was scale, ambition, and a patron rich enough to let him think enormous. Milan would give him all three. The letter to Milan. Around 1482, Leonardo packed up and traveled to Milan. The exact reasons are not fully recorded, but we can reconstruct the situation. Florence was crowded with brilliant artists. The Medici had their favorites, and Leonardo, for all his gifts, was not at the very center of their patronage. He may have felt overlooked. He may have wanted a fresh start somewhere. His reputation for not finishing things had not yet followed him, and Milan offered something Florence did not. It was ruled by a court hungry for prestige and engineering, in the middle of building and fortifying on a grand scale, and willing to pay a versatile talent very well. Milan was a different kind of place from Florence. Florence liked to call itself a republic. Milan was openly a duchy, ruled by the Sforza family, who had seized power a generation earlier. The effective ruler when Leonardo arrived was Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moor, probably because of his dark complexion. Ludovico was officially only the regent, governing on behalf of his young nephew, the rightful duke, but in practice, he ran the state and would soon take the title for himself. He was clever, ambitious, suspicious, and lavish. He wanted Milan to outshine every other court in Italy, and he wanted to project an image of strength against rivals both inside Italy and beyond the Alps. Leonardo understood his audience. When he sought a position at Ludovico's court, he wrote, or had drafted, a remarkable letter applying for work. What is striking about this letter is what it emphasizes. Leonardo barely mentions painting. He spends almost the entire letter advertising himself as a military engineer. He lists, point by point, the things he can build. Portable bridges for pursuing or escaping an enemy. Methods for draining the water from defensive ditches during a siege. Ways to destroy any fortress or stronghold not built on solid rock. Cannons that hurl small stones like a storm, causing panic and damage. Covered chariots, safe and unassailable, that could break through enemy ranks. Catapults and other engines of remarkable power. Ships that could resist the heaviest cannon fire. And, almost as an afterthought at the very end, he adds that in times of peace he can also do architecture, hydraulic engineering, sculpture, and painting as well as anyone, and that he could undertake the great bronze horse that would honor the memory of Ludovico's father. It is a job application, and it is a masterpiece of telling a powerful man exactly what he wants to hear. Ludovico was preparing for the possibility of war. He wanted military prowess, so Leonardo led with weapons. Whether Leonardo could actually deliver most of what he promised in that letter is another question. And the honest answer is that many of those war machines were never built, and some of them, on close inspection, would not have worked. But the letter got him in the door. He entered the orbit of the Milanese court and would remain attached to it, with interruptions, for nearly 20 years. These would be, in many ways, the most productive years of his life. Here is a fun fact worth pausing on. For all his fame as an inventor of war machines, Leonardo had a deep hatred of war itself. In his notebooks, he described it, in his own words, as the most beastly madness, pazzia bestialissima. He designed weapons of destruction and at the same time recoiled from what they did. He once held back a design for an underwater attack device, a kind of early submarine concept, writing that he would not publish or share the method because of the evil nature of men, who would use it to commit murder at the bottom of the sea by sinking ships and the crews inside them. So the man selling himself as a military engineer to a warlord was privately disgusted by the whole business. That contradiction sits right at the heart of who he was. In Milan, Leonardo set up a household and a workshop of his own. He took on assistants and apprentices. He began to keep his notebooks in earnest, filling page after page with everything that caught his attention. And he started to receive the kind of major commissions that a court could provide. 2 of them would become among the most famous things he ever made. One was a painting on a wall in a monastery dining hall. The other was a horse, the largest bronze statue anyone had ever attempted. The musician, the pageants, and the cathedral. We tend to remember Leonardo for paintings and machines, but to the court of Milan he was, in his first years there, something else entirely. He was an entertainer, a musician, and a designer of spectacles. This side of him is almost forgotten now, partly because spectacle is by nature temporary. A festival lasts a night and then is gone. But for years, a large part of what Leonardo actually did for his patron was stagecraft. He was, by the accounts of the time, a gifted musician. He played a stringed instrument called the lyre, and he was said to play it beautifully and to sing and improvise verses while he played. There is a famous detail that he designed and built his own lyre, made partly of silver and shaped, strikingly, like a horse's skull, which was supposed to give it a louder, clearer tone. One account even says that the reason he first came to Milan was as a musician, sent as a kind of diplomatic gift, carrying this silver lyre, and that his playing impressed the court before his painting did. Whether or not that is precisely how he arrived, it tells you that music was a real and respected part of his abilities, not a hobby. At the Sforza court, Leonardo became the master of revels, the man who designed the elaborate festivals, weddings, and pageants that a Renaissance ruler used to display his wealth and power. The greatest of these was a celebration known as the Feast of Paradise, staged for a royal wedding. Leonardo built a mechanical theater of the heavens, a great dome or vault representing paradise, with the planets and signs of the zodiac, and performers costumed as the celestial bodies who descended and moved through the spectacle. He engineered the moving parts, the lighting, the costumes, the whole illusion. Guests described it with amazement. For Leonardo, this was not a distraction from his serious work. It was a laboratory. The gears, levers, rotating platforms, and mechanical effects he devised for these shows fed directly into his engineering notebooks. The man designing a cloud machine for a wedding was the same man designing cranes and automata, and the skills crossed over completely. He also turned his attention to architecture, though here, as so often, his grandest ideas remained on paper. When the great cathedral of Milan needed a central tower and dome over its crossing, a competition was held for the design, and Leonardo entered it. He built a wooden model and studied the structural problem with real seriousness, even comparing the cracking of a building under stress to the way a sick body fails, applying his anatomical thinking to architecture. In the end, the commission went to others, and his design was not used, but his notebooks from this period are full of architectural studies, plans for churches built on perfect geometric forms, domes, and centrally planned buildings of great elegance. His most ambitious architectural thinking came out of disaster. In the late 1480s, Milan was struck by an outbreak of plague that killed a huge portion of the city's population. Leonardo, characteristically, did not respond with prayers or resignation. He responded with a design. He sketched out a plan for an entirely new kind of city, an ideal city built to prevent disease from spreading. His city had 2 levels. The upper level, with wide roads and open walkways, was for pedestrians and the respectable classes. The lower level, connected to canals, was for carts, deliveries, services, and the removal of waste and sewage, kept out of sight and away from where people walked and breathed. He designed for clean water, for circulation, for sanitation, reasoning that the filth and crowding of the medieval city were what bred the sickness. He was thinking about urban public health centuries before anyone understood germs, getting to the right policies, separation of waste from people, clean water, space and air, by sheer observation and reason. The ideal city was never built, of course, but the thinking behind it was, once again, generations ahead of its moment. This is the through line of his Milan years that gets lost behind the famous painting on the monastery wall. While he labored on the Last Supper, he was also playing music at court, building mechanical heavens for weddings, modeling cathedral domes, and redesigning the city to defeat the plague. He was not a painter who occasionally dabbled in other things. He was a court polymath whose painting was only one stream among many, and to him they were all the same activity, the application of a curious and capable mind to whatever problem was in front of it. The Last Supper. Sometime in the middle of the 1490s, Ludovico Sforza commissioned Leonardo to paint a scene on the end wall of the dining hall, the refectory, of a monastery in Milan called Santa Maria delle Grazie. The subject was the Last Supper, the final meal that Jesus shared with his 12 apostles before his arrest and crucifixion. It was a traditional subject for a monastery dining room. The monks would eat their own meals in the presence of this painted meal, and the image was meant to encourage reflection. Other artists had painted the Last Supper many times. The standard approach was static and calm. Jesus sat at the center of a long table. The apostles ranged on either side, everyone composed, usually with one figure, Judas, the betrayer, placed alone on the near side of the table so you could identify the villain. It was a tableau, a frozen holy moment. Leonardo did something completely different, and it changed Western art. He chose to paint not a calm tableau, but a specific, dramatic instant. He painted the moment immediately after Jesus has said the words, "One of you will betray me." He painted the reaction, the shock, the confusion, the protest, the dismay rippling down the table as 12 men suddenly turned to one another asking, in effect, "Is it me? Is it him who could do such a thing?" Every apostle responds differently, in body and face, and Leonardo grouped them into clusters of 3, each group a little drama of gesture and expression. One throws up his hands, one leans back in alarm, one points upward, one spreads his palms in denial. Judas, instead of being isolated on the wrong side of the table, is now in the crowd, clutching a small bag, presumably the silver he was paid, and recoiling slightly into shadow, knocking over a salt cellar. You identify him not by his position, but by his guilty reaction. To make the scene work, Leonardo used the new science of linear perspective with total command. All the lines of the ceiling and the walls of the painted room converge on a single point, and that point sits right behind the head of Jesus. Your eye is pulled, mathematically and inevitably, to the calm center of the storm. The windows behind open onto a peaceful landscape. The whole composition is built so that the figure of Christ is the still point around which all the human turmoil moves. It is one of the most perfectly organized paintings ever made, and it looks effortless, which is the hardest thing to achieve. The monks, however, had to wait. Leonardo did not paint quickly. He thought, he stared at the wall, he made changes. There is a wonderful contemporary account from a writer named Matteo Bandello, who, as a boy, watched Leonardo at work. He described how Leonardo would arrive early, climb up onto the scaffolding, and paint from dawn to dusk without stopping to eat or drink, completely absorbed. Then, on other days, he would not touch the painting at all. He would come, stand, and look at what he had done, study the figures, and leave again. And on still other days, Bandello recalled, Leonardo would be working somewhere else entirely across the city, and would suddenly drop everything, rush over to the monastery, climb the scaffold, add 2 or 3 brush strokes to a single figure, and then leave. He worked, in other words, the way a thinker works, not the way a tradesman works, and it drove the prior of the monastery to distraction. There is a famous story, again from Vasari, about that impatient prior who complained to Ludovico that Leonardo was taking forever and seemed to spend half his time just standing and thinking. Leonardo's reply, when the Duke asked him about it, was that the greatest geniuses sometimes accomplish more when they work less, because they are searching in their minds for ideas, and he added slyly that he still had 2 heads left to finish. One was the head of Christ, for which he could find no earthly model worthy enough, and the other was the head of Judas, the traitor, for which, he said, he had been searching the city for a face vile enough. But, he suggested, if he truly could not find a sufficiently odious model for Judas, he could always use the face of the prior who kept nagging him. The complaint stopped. Now, here is the tragedy of the Last Supper, and it is a perfect example of how Leonardo's curiosity sometimes worked against him. The normal way to paint a large image on a wall was the technique called fresco. In true fresco, you paint with pigment onto wet, freshly laid plaster, and as the plaster dries, the color becomes chemically bound into the wall itself. It is extremely durable, but fresco has a brutal limitation. You have to work fast, on the wet plaster, section by section, and you cannot go back and rework an area once it has dried. For an artist like Leonardo, who needed to layer, adjust, blend, and refine endlessly, who built his subtle effects through slow glazing and reworking, true fresco was almost unusable. It demanded exactly the kind of fast, committed, irreversible work that he could not do. So he experimented. He invented his own method, painting onto the dry wall with a mixture of oil and tempera, sealed over a ground he had prepared. This let him work slowly and rework as much as he liked. It allowed him to achieve the soft transitions and deep shadows he wanted, and it began to fail almost immediately. The paint did not bond properly to the wall. Within a couple of decades, the surface was already flaking and deteriorating. By the middle of the 16th century, observers described it as ruined. Over the following centuries, it suffered damp, clumsy restorations, the cutting of a doorway through the bottom of the wall, smoke, and during the Second World War, a bomb that destroyed part of the refectory and left the wall protected only by sandbags. The painting we see today is a ghost, heavily restored, a fraction of its original surface surviving. And yet, even in that battered state, its power and its composition come through so strongly that it remains one of the most reproduced and studied images in the world. The lesson of the Last Supper is the lesson of Leonardo in miniature. He could not accept the limitations of a proven method, so he invented a better one for his purposes, and his invention failed in the long run. He bought himself the freedom to make a greater painting at the cost of that painting's survival. It is hard to think of a better illustration of how his genius and his weaknesses were the same trait pointed in different directions. The Virgin of the Rocks. There is another major painting from the Milan years that deserves attention, both for what it is and for the strange legal saga attached to it. It is called The Virgin of the Rocks, and unusually, it exists in two versions. painted years apart, which today hang in 2 different countries. The story of why there are 2 is a window into the unglamorous reality of being a Renaissance artist, which was less about inspiration and more about contracts, payment disputes, and lawsuits. Soon after arriving in Milan, Leonardo and 2 local brothers, also painters, took on a commission from a religious confraternity to produce a large altarpiece for a chapel. Leonardo was to paint the central panel. The subject he produced was unlike any standard altarpiece. Instead of placing the holy figures in a gold-backed heaven or a tidy architectural setting, he set the Virgin Mary, the infant Christ, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel inside a wild, shadowy grotto, a rocky cave with strange geological formations, plants growing in the crevices, and water in the distance. It is a painting full of his obsessions. The rocks are rendered with a geologist's attention. The plants are botanically accurate. The light falls into the cave and models the faces with that soft, smoky gradation he had mastered. The figures are arranged in a stable pyramid, calm and tender, the angel turning to look out at us. It is mysterious, dim, and utterly original, a sacred scene staged inside the kind of natural cave that had fascinated him since boyhood. And then came the argument. The confraternity that commissioned it and the artists fell into a long dispute over money. The painters felt they had been underpaid for the work and the materials. The patrons disagreed. The quarrel dragged on for years, even decades, through complaints, appeals, and negotiations. At some point, Leonardo apparently sold or otherwise disposed of the first version of the painting to another buyer, which only deepened the conflict, since it was supposed to be the property of the chapel. To satisfy the contract, a second version of the painting was eventually produced, with the involvement of Leonardo and his workshop, similar in composition but different in important details: the lighting, the colors, the angel's pointing hand, the halos. The result is that today we have 2 versions of the rocks. One, generally considered the earlier and more fully Leonardo's own hand, hangs in the Louvre in Paris. The other, completed later with more workshop involvement, hangs in the National Gallery in London. Standing in front of each, you can see they are versions of the same vision, and scholars still debate exactly how much of each was painted by Leonardo himself versus his assistants. The Virgin of the Rocks matters for 2 reasons. First, as a painting, it shows him importing his scientific obsessions directly into sacred art. Most painters would never have buried the Holy Family in a dim geological cavern. Leonardo did, because the cave and the rocks and the plants were as interesting to him as the holy figures, and he could not paint a setting he had not first understood. Second, the long money dispute reminds us that even the supreme genius of the age spent years of his life arguing about payment. Just like any tradesman, the romantic image of the artist floating above worldly concerns is a later invention. The real Leonardo signed contracts, missed deadlines, haggled over fees, and went to law over an unpaid bill, all while producing some of the most original images ever made. The horse that was never cast. While he was working on The Last Supper, Leonardo was also pursuing the project he had dangled at the end of his job application letter: the Great Bronze Horse. Ludovico wanted an enormous equestrian monument to honor his father, Francesco Sforza, the soldier of fortune who had founded the family's hold on Milan. An equestrian statue, a man on horseback cast in bronze, was the ultimate symbol of power and permanence, going back to ancient Rome. To commission one was to declare that your dynasty belonged among the great rulers of history. Leonardo did not want to make an ordinary equestrian statue. He wanted to make the largest one in the world, several times life-size, a horse standing around 7 meters tall, which is more than 20 feet. The technical problems were staggering. Bronze casting works by making a mold, melting an enormous quantity of metal, and pouring it in to fill the cavity, all without the mold cracking or the metal cooling unevenly. Casting a statue of that size in a single operation had never been done. Earlier sculptors had cast large horses, but nothing on this scale, and the usual solution of casting in pieces created its own difficulties. Leonardo approached it the way he approached everything, by studying from life and from first principles. He went to the stables, including the ducal stables, and he studied horses obsessively. He drew them from every angle, measured their proportions, analyzed how their muscles moved when they walked and reared, and filled notebooks with detailed studies of equine anatomy. He worked out the engineering of the casting, designing a system to pour the bronze in a single continuous flow and devising the furnaces and molds required. He spent years on it. Eventually, around 1493, he completed a full-size model of the horse, not in bronze, but in clay. This clay horse, towering and magnificent, was put on public display in Milan, and it astonished everyone who saw it. Contemporaries wrote about it with awe. By the testimony of the time, it was the most impressive sculpture of a horse anyone had made. All that remained was to cast it, for which Ludovico had set aside a huge quantity of bronze, something on the order of 70 tons of metal. And then history intervened, in the way it so often did in Leonardo's life. In 1494, the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, beginning a long series of wars that would tear the peninsula apart for decades. Suddenly, Milan was under military threat. Ludovico needed cannon, and cannon were made of bronze. The metal that had been set aside for Leonardo's horse was sent off to Ludovico's father-in-law to be cast into artillery for the defense of the realm. The horse would not be cast. The bronze had gone to war. The great clay model stood in Milan, unrealized, for a few more years. Then, in 1499, the French finally took the city, drove out Ludovico, and occupied Milan. According to accounts of the time, French soldiers, specifically a company of Gascon archers, used the giant clay horse for target practice and destroyed it. Leonardo had spent more than a decade, on and off, designing and modeling the largest bronze statue ever conceived. In the end, the bronze became weapons, and the model became rubble, riddled with arrows by bored soldiers. Not a single piece of it survives. We know it only from his drawings and from the descriptions of people who saw the clay colossus before it fell. There is a strange and moving footnote to this story. Almost 500 years later, in the 1990s, an American collector funded a project to build the horse Leonardo never cast, using his surviving drawings and the best modern understanding of his intentions. A bronze horse based on his designs now stands in Milan, and a copy stands in the United States. It is the closest thing we have to seeing what he saw in his mind. But of course it is not really his. It is a tribute, made by other hands, to a masterpiece that existed only as a possibility. The notebooks. We need to stop the narrative of paintings and patrons for a moment, because to understand Leonardo at all, you have to understand the notebooks. They are the real key to him, and they are unlike anything else produced in his century or for centuries afterward. Throughout his adult life, Leonardo carried small notebooks with him and filled larger ones at home. He wrote and drew on whatever caught his interest, with no apparent system. A single page might contain a careful anatomical drawing, a geometric proof, a sketch of a friend, a shopping list, a reminder of money owed, a design for a machine, a study of how water swirls around an obstacle, and a private note to himself, all crammed together and written in his mirror script from right to left. Over his life, he produced thousands upon thousands of these pages. Around 7,000 survive today, and scholars estimate that this is perhaps a third or less of what he originally created. The rest is lost. What is on these pages is staggering in its range. There is anatomy, which we will come to, some of the most accurate human anatomical drawing produced before the modern era. There is the study of water, which obsessed him. He drew the way streams flow, the way water curls and eddies around piers and stones, the way waves form, the patterns of turbulence. He saw connections everywhere. He compared the branching of rivers to the branching of blood vessels and of plant stems. He compared the curls of flowing water to the curls of flowing hair. He believed that the same underlying patterns and laws appeared again and again across nature, in the body, in the landscape, in the movement of air, and he wanted to find them. There are studies of light and shadow and optics, because to paint well he needed to understand how light behaves, and that understanding spilled over into genuine investigation of how the eye works and how vision happens. There are studies of plants, of the growth of trees, of the arrangement of leaves. There are drawings of geological formations, of the layering of rock, of fossils. In one of his most remarkable insights, Leonardo looked at fossil seashells found high up in the mountains, far from any sea, and reasoned correctly that these had once been living creatures on an ancient seafloor, and that the land must have changed over enormous spans of time. This was centuries before geology became a science, and it directly contradicted the common explanation of his day, which attributed such shells to the biblical flood. Leonardo pointed out that a single flood could not account for the layers, the way the shells were sorted, and the conditions in which they were found. He was reading the history of the earth out of the rocks, by himself, and getting it largely right. There are designs for machines of every kind. Gears, pulleys, cranes, mills, looms, pumps, cutting tools, devices for grinding and polishing, mechanisms for transmitting and transforming motion. Many of these were practical solutions to real problems of his era. Others were speculative. And there are the famous designs that we will look at separately, the flying machines and the war machines that reach far beyond what his century could build. And there is writing, notes to himself, lists of books he wanted to read, lists of people who might teach him things, drafts of letters, fables, jokes, riddles, and reflections. Through these we get glimpses of his mind and even his personality. He was funny. He collected and wrote down jokes and riddles. He was relentlessly self-improving. One famous list, scrawled as a memo to himself, is essentially a to-do list of things to learn, and it reads like the agenda of a one-man university. He reminds himself to find out the measurement of Milan and its suburbs, to get a certain master of arithmetic to show him how to square a triangle, to ask a particular gentleman about the artillery, to find a master of hydraulics and learn how to repair a lock and canal, to draw Milan, to learn the multiplication of roots from a certain master, and to get hold of various specific books. It is the most charming document, a snapshot of a mind that simply wanted to know everything and treated the whole city as a faculty of experts to be consulted. The scattered notebooks survive today under a collection of names that reflect the collectors and institutions that gathered them. The largest single hoard, hundreds of pages bound together, is the Codex Atlanticus, held in Milan. There is the Codex Arundel in the British Library in London, the Codex Leicester now in private American hands, and a great collection of his anatomical and other drawings held in the Royal Collection at Windsor in England. There are codices in Paris, gathered up by Napoleon's armies when they swept through Italy, and codices elsewhere across Europe. The dispersal was so complete that as recently as 1965, two important notebooks by Leonardo, known now as the Madrid Codices, were rediscovered after being misfiled and effectively lost for centuries in the National Library of Spain. Imagine that. As late as the 1960s, major works by the most famous mind of the Renaissance were still turning up, having sat unrecognized on a shelf. It is a reminder of how careless history was with his legacy, and how much of what we now treasure came within an inch of vanishing for good. There is one notebook project that did, eventually, reach the world, though only after his death, and only because of the loyalty of his pupil. Throughout his life, Leonardo gathered notes toward a great treatise on painting, setting down his thinking on perspective, light, shadow, proportion, the depiction of movement and emotion, and the relationship of painting to the other arts. He never finished or published it. After his death, his heir Francesco Melzi painstakingly compiled these scattered notes into a manuscript, and over the following generations, this compilation, known as the Treatise on Painting, circulated, was copied, and was eventually printed. It became influential among later artists and academies, one of the few cases where Leonardo's written thought actually escaped the locked vault of his private pages and shaped the people who came after him. It survived only because one devoted young man refused to let it disappear. Here is a second fun fact. Leonardo's notebooks were nearly lost entirely. When Leonardo died, he left them to his favorite pupil, who took them back to Italy. After that pupil's death, the collection was scattered, broken up, sold, and dispersed across Europe. Pages were cut out, rebound into different volumes, and traded among collectors who often had no idea what they were holding. One major collection of his sheets, known today as the Codex Leicester, was eventually bought, in the 1990s, by Bill Gates, for a sum reported at over $30 million, which makes it one of the most expensive manuscripts ever sold. The pages of a man who could not afford a university education are now among the most valuable handwritten documents on earth. The notebooks also explain one of the great puzzles about Leonardo. If he understood so much, why did almost none of it influence the science of his time? The answer is that he never published. He talked, throughout his life, about organizing his notes into proper treatises on painting, on water, on anatomy, on the flight of birds, on mechanics. He drafted introductions. He sorted some pages. But he never finished and published the systematic books he imagined. His knowledge stayed locked in his private, mirror-written, chaotically organized pages, which were then scattered after his death and not fully studied and understood until centuries later. So his discoveries, brilliant as they were, mostly had to be made all over again by other people who never knew he had been there first. He was not a link in the chain of scientific progress, because he never showed his work to the world. He was a magnificent dead end, a preview of discoveries that the rest of humanity would not reach for generations. Anatomy and the human machine. Of everything in the notebooks, the anatomical work may be the most astonishing, and it deserves its own chapter, because it shows how far Leonardo was willing to go in pursuit of understanding. It began, as so much of his work did, with painting. To paint the human body convincingly, an artist needs to understand what lies beneath the skin, how muscles bulge and stretch, how the body is structured. Many Renaissance artists studied a bit of surface anatomy for this reason. Leonardo went much further than a painter needed to go. He wanted to understand the body as a system, as a machine, from the bones outward to the muscles, the nerves, the blood vessels, and the organs. To do this, he dissected human corpses. This was difficult, distasteful, and in some times and places forbidden or restricted. Dissection had to be done quickly, before decay set in, often by candlelight, in the cold, surrounded by the smell of death, with no preservation and no refrigeration. Leonardo described the grim reality of it in his notes, the fear and disgust of spending the night hours in the company of dismembered and flayed corpses, horrible to behold. He did it anyway, repeatedly. Over his career, he claimed to have dissected around 30 human bodies, working at various points in hospitals where the unclaimed dead were available, including, in his later years, an old man who died in a hospital in Florence, and whose body Leonardo opened to find the cause of so gentle a death. What he produced from these dissections were anatomical drawings of a quality that simply did not exist before and would not be matched for a long time afterward. He drew the skeleton accurately. He drew the muscles in layers, showing how they attach and how they would move. He invented techniques of anatomical illustration that we still use, showing a structure from multiple angles on the same page, drawing exploded views, and even injecting wax into the chambers of the heart and the ventricles of the brain to capture their true shape, then drawing from the cast. That technique, injecting a structure to reveal its form, was genuinely original and would not become standard practice for centuries. His study of the heart was especially advanced. He drew the heart in extraordinary detail, identified that it had 4 chambers rather than the commonly believed lesser number, and studied the aortic valve so closely that he worked out how the swirling motion of blood, the vortices, helps the valve close. This particular insight about blood flow in the aorta was so far ahead of its time that it was only confirmed by medical researchers using advanced imaging in the 20th century. He studied a fetus in the womb and produced a drawing of an unborn child curled inside the uterus that remains one of the most famous anatomical images ever made, accurate in most respects, despite some details he borrowed from animal anatomy because human material was so hard to obtain. His dissection of that gentle old man in the Florence hospital led to another remarkable observation. When Leonardo opened the body, he examined the blood vessels and noticed that the arteries of the old man were thick, hard, and narrowed, choked and twisted, while the vessels of a young child he had also examined were smooth and open. He reasoned that the man had died simply because his blood could no longer pass easily through these hardened, constricted channels, depriving the body of nourishment. What he was describing, centuries before anyone had a name for it, was the hardening and clogging of the arteries that we now call atherosclerosis, and he connected it correctly to aging and to the manner of the man's quiet death. He had no theory of cholesterol or circulation in the modern sense. The full circulation of the blood would not be worked out until more than a century after his death. But by looking carefully and reasoning honestly from what he saw, he had identified a real and major cause of death and tied it to the aging of the vessels. It is a small masterpiece of pure observation, and like almost everything else in the notebooks, it was seen by no one and helped no patient for hundreds of years. He compared the human body to machines and to the rest of nature constantly. He saw the arm as a system of levers and pulleys. He compared the action of muscles to ropes. He saw the body as the supreme machine and tried to reverse engineer it. He planned a complete treatise on human anatomy, organized systematically, and he got a long way toward it in his drawings and notes. Had he published it, it would have transformed medicine and stood as one of the foundational texts of the science. The first great printed anatomy book that did transform the field was published by Andreas Vesalius in 1543, decades after Leonardo's death, by a man who had never seen Leonardo's hidden drawings. Leonardo had done much of the same work first, alone, and shown it to almost no one. There is something almost painful about this. Leonardo stood, more than once, on the edge of discoveries that would have changed the course of science. And again, because he did not finish, did not publish, and did not connect his private investigations to the wider community of learning, the discoveries fell back into the dark, waiting for someone else to make them again. The tragedy is not that he failed to understand, he understood. The tragedy is that his understanding died with him in coded notebooks that the world would not read for hundreds of years. Dreams of flight and engines of war. Now we come to the inventions that have made Leonardo a permanent fixture of popular imagination. The flying machines, the tank, the diving suit, the parachute, the helicopter. These designs, scattered through his notebooks, are the reason he is often described as a man who lived 500 years before his time. They deserve a clear-eyed look, because the truth is more interesting than the legend. Start with flight, which was perhaps his deepest obsession. From the bird in his cradle to the end of his life, Leonardo was fascinated by how things fly. He studied birds with the same intensity he brought to everything. He filled a whole small notebook, known as the Codex on the Flight of Birds, with detailed observations of how birds use their wings, how they balance, how they use the wind, how they turn and descend. He understood, in part, that air is a fluid that a wing pushes against, and that a bird does not simply flap downward but works the air in a complex way. He was reaching toward the real principles of flight. From this, he designed flying machines. Some were based directly on the bird, with great flapping wings that a human operator would power by working levers and pedals with arms and legs. These were never going to work, and the reason is simple physics that Leonardo could not have known. The human body does not have anything close to the power-to-weight ratio needed to flap a wing and lift itself off the ground. No amount of clever mechanism can get around the fact that our muscles are too weak relative to our weight. The dream of human-powered flapping flight, the ornithopter, was a dead end, and Leonardo poured years into it. But not all of his flight work was a dead end. He also sketched a design that has been called a helicopter, the famous aerial screw, a great spiral that was meant to be spun rapidly to bore up into the air, like a screw threading into wood. It would not have flown, for the same power reasons and for aerodynamic ones, but the underlying idea of a rotor that pushes against the air points toward the real principle of the helicopter. He sketched a pyramid-shaped parachute with a note that a man could jump from any height with such a device and come to no harm. In 2000, a skydiver actually built a parachute to Leonardo's design and specifications and jumped from a balloon. It worked. Leonardo's parachute, 500 years late, carried a man safely down. He also studied and designed what amounts to a glider, a fixed-wing craft, and some scholars think his later flight studies were moving away from flapping and toward gliding, which is the direction that actual aviation would eventually take. There is a tantalizing hint that he may have planned an actual test. In his notes he wrote, in an excited aside, that the great bird, meaning his flying machine, would take its first flight from the back of a particular hill, a place near Florence, sometimes identified as Monte Cesare. He wrote of filling the universe with wonder and of winning eternal glory by it. Whether any test was ever attempted and whether some assistant was sent off a hillside in one of his contraptions, we do not know for certain. There is a later story that one of his helpers, a colorful character known by a nickname, did try to fly with wings and crashed, breaking a leg. The evidence is thin and probably half legend, but the note in his own hand shows that for Leonardo, the flying machine was not pure theory. At least once, he believed he was close enough to flight to name the hill it would launch from. Then there are the war machines, the ones he advertised to Ludovico. The most famous is his design for an armored fighting vehicle, often called his tank. It is a circular, turtle-shaped armored shell on wheels, bristling with cannon pointing out in all directions, with men inside cranking it forward and firing. It is unmistakably the ancestor, in concept, of the modern tank by 400 years. There is a famous quirk, though. As drawn in his notebook, the gears that drive the wheels are arranged so that the front and rear wheels would turn in opposite directions, meaning the machine could not actually move. Some scholars think this was a deliberate error, a way of sabotaging the design so it could not be stolen and used. Others think it was simply a mistake. We do not know. He designed a giant crossbow of enormous scale, multi-barreled guns that are sometimes called early machine guns because they were meant to fire a volley and rotate to fire again, scythed chariots with whirling blades to cut down infantry, and fortifications designed to deflect cannon fire with angled, sloping walls. That last idea, angled defensive walls to deflect artillery, was genuinely sound and reflected the real military engineering revolution of his era. He designed the diving suit and breathing apparatus for the underwater attack he later suppressed. He designed bridges, including a single-span bridge to cross a wide bay that he proposed to the Ottoman Sultan, a design that engineers in modern times have judged to be sound and have actually built as a smaller footbridge. So how do we weigh all this? Here is the honest assessment. Leonardo was not a wizard who saw the future. He was a brilliant engineer working with the materials, the power sources, and the scientific knowledge of around 1500. Many of his most famous inventions could not have worked, because the necessary power sources, the engine, the motor, did not exist and would not exist for centuries. You cannot have powered flight without a powerful light engine, and there was no such thing in his world. What he had instead was an extraordinary ability to identify the right problems, to break them down, to reason about forces and mechanisms, and to imagine solutions in concrete, drawn detail. He thought like a modern engineer in a world that had no modern materials or power. His designs are not blueprints that would work if only someone had built them. They are the visible record of a mind reasoning correctly toward goals that his century could not reach. That is rarer and more impressive than a lucky guess about the future. He was not predicting. He was reasoning further and harder than anyone around him. The fall of Milan and the wandering years. For nearly 17 years, Milan had been Leonardo's home, and Ludovico Sforza his patron. That world ended in 1499. The French king Louis XII pressed a claim to the Duchy of Milan, invaded, and took the city. Ludovico fled, tried to return, was betrayed by his own Swiss mercenaries, and was captured by the French. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner in France, where he eventually died. The court that had employed Leonardo, paid him, and given him his greatest commissions, was simply gone. Leonardo, now in his late 40s, was suddenly a man without a patron in a country sliding into war. He left Milan, taking with him his notebooks, his assistants, and his accumulated savings, which he prudently deposited in a bank in Florence. For the next several years, his life became unsettled and itinerant. He traveled. He spent time in Mantua, where he drew a famous portrait in chalk of the Marchioness Isabella d'Este, a powerful and cultured noblewoman who then spent years, in vain, trying to get him to turn the drawing into a finished painting. He went to Venice, the great maritime republic, where he briefly advised on military matters, proposing, among other things, defenses against a feared Ottoman Turkish attack, including his ideas for underwater warfare. Then, in 1502, Leonardo took one of the strangest jobs of his career. He went to work for Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was the son of Pope Alexander VI, a ruthless, brilliant, and terrifying military commander who was carving out a state for himself in central Italy through a combination of war, treachery, and political murder. He was, by reputation, one of the most dangerous men in Italy, and he became the model for the cold, calculating prince in Niccolò Machiavelli's famous book on power. Machiavelli, as it happens, was also in Cesare Borgia's orbit at the same time as Leonardo, and the two men, the great artist-engineer and the great political theorist, knew each other and apparently held each other in some regard. For about a year, Leonardo served Cesare Borgia as a senior military engineer, touring his fortresses, inspecting and improving defenses, and producing maps. The maps Leonardo made during this period are themselves a marvel. His map of the town of Imola is a perfect overhead plan, drawn as if seen from directly above, with every street and building precisely placed, in an age when maps were usually crude pictorial sketches. It looks like a modern city plan or a satellite image. To make it, he physically paced and measured the streets and used instruments to record angles and distances, then assembled the whole into a single, accurate bird's-eye view. As a piece of cartography, it was generations ahead of its time. Why a man who hated war so deeply, spent a year serving one of the most violent warlords of the age, is a question worth sitting with. The likeliest answers are money, the security of a powerful patron in dangerous times, and perhaps the sheer engineering interest of the work. Whatever the reason, he did not stay long. Cesare Borgia's fortunes collapsed after his father the Pope died, and Leonardo moved on, returning to Florence, the city he had left 2 decades before. Back in Florence, Leonardo and Machiavelli crossed paths again on one of the most ambitious engineering schemes of the age, and it tells you a great deal about how his mind could leap from a problem to a vast solution. Florence was at war with the nearby city of Pisa, which sat downstream on the Arno River and controlled Florence's access to the sea. The idea, which Machiavelli championed and Leonardo helped design, was breathtaking in scale. They would divert the entire Arno River away from Pisa, cutting off its water and its trade, and at the same time give Florence a navigable canal straight to the coast. Leonardo studied the river, drew the terrain, and worked out the engineering of the great diversion, the channels, the volumes of earth, the machines to move it. He even sketched a giant excavating machine to speed the digging. Work actually began. Thousands of laborers were put to the task, and it failed. The plan was beyond the technology of the day. The channels were dug too shallow, a flood undid much of the work, and the scheme was abandoned at great cost. It is a perfect example of Leonardo's reach exceeding his century's grasp. The vision was correct in principle. Rivers can be diverted, canals can be cut, but the tools and the money to do it on that scale simply did not exist yet. He could see the solution. He could not, with the means of 1500, build it. The return to Florence and the Mona Lisa. When Leonardo came back to Florence around 1503, he returned as a celebrity. The unknown young apprentice who had left for Milan was now the most famous artist in Italy, a man whose name carried weight. The city was proud to have him and eager to give him work. It was in this period, in the first years of the 16th century, that he began the painting that would become, by a wide margin, the most famous picture in the world. The Mona Lisa is a portrait of a woman. The most likely identification, supported by a contemporary note discovered in recent years, is that she was Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. This is why the painting is also called La Gioconda in Italian and La Joconde in French, a play on her married name that also happens to suggest a jolly or smiling person. The commission was, on its face, an ordinary one. A prosperous merchant wanted a portrait of his young wife, probably to mark the birth of a child or the purchase of a house. For a long time, the identity of the sitter was uncertain and much debated, with all sorts of romantic theories proposed. Then, in 2005, a scholar found a handwritten note in the margin of an old book, written by a Florentine official who knew Leonardo, dated to 1503, recording that Leonardo was at that moment working on a portrait of Lisa, the wife of Francesco del Giocondo. That single marginal note, scribbled by a clerk 500 years ago, settled most of the argument and confirmed who the woman, in the most famous painting in the world, most likely was. What Leonardo did with this ordinary commission was extraordinary, and to see why, you have to understand what portraits looked like before. The standard portrait of the time was stiff and formal. The sitter was usually shown in strict profile, like a head on a coin, or facing forward in a rigid pose, set against a plain or simple background, presented as a kind of inventory of status. The point was to record a person's rank and features, not to capture an inner life. Leonardo broke all of it. He turned the sitter to a three-quarter view, so she faces slightly toward us and seems to meet our eyes. He brought her hands into the picture, folded calmly, which makes her feel present and composed and real. He set her against a vast, dreamlike landscape of winding rivers, distant mountains, and hazy atmosphere, which recedes into a blue distance, using his deep understanding of how the air softens and cools the color of faraway things. And he painted her face with a technique he had perfected, called sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke. Instead of drawing hard lines around the features, he blended the transitions between light and shadow so softly, in layer upon layer of thin, almost transparent glazes, that there are no edges at all. The forms emerge from shadow the way a real face does in real light, and the corners of the mouth and eyes dissolve into soft uncertainty. That softness, that blurring at the corners of the mouth, is the secret of the famous smile. Because the edges of her expression are deliberately indistinct, the smile seems to change. Look directly at her mouth and it seems faint. Look at her eyes and the smile seems to deepen because of the way our peripheral vision and our central vision process the blurred shadows differently. The expression is not fixed. It shifts as your eye moves and as the light changes, and so the woman seems alive in a way that a sharply painted face never could be. She seems to be on the edge of a thought, about to speak, or about to smile more fully, caught in a living instant. People have stared at this effect for 500 years and still cannot quite pin it down, which is exactly the point. Leonardo never delivered the Mona Lisa to the merchant who commissioned it. He kept it. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, from Florence to Milan to Rome and finally to France, and he kept working on it, on and off, for years and years. It was with him when he died. This is part of why it is so refined. He had unlimited time to layer and adjust it, because he never let it go. The painting we now line up by the thousands to glimpse through bulletproof glass in the Louvre was, for Leonardo, a personal object he could not bring himself to finish or surrender, a problem he kept returning to until the end. The painting's global fame, it is worth saying, is partly a product of later history. For centuries, it was admired, but not uniquely worshipped. Its leap to absolute superstardom was helped enormously when, in 1911, it was stolen from the Louvre by an Italian workman who believed it should be returned to Italy. The theft was an international sensation. The empty space on the wall drew crowds, and when the painting was recovered 2 years later, it had become the most famous picture on the planet. So the Mona Lisa we know is the product of two things: Leonardo's revolutionary technique and a 20th century crime that turned it into a household name: the battle that vanished. While he was in Florence, Leonardo was drawn into a project that pitted him against the one artist of the age who could rival him, and the story of that contest, and its failure, is one of the great lost moments in art history. The government of Florence, in its Grand Council Hall, the seat of the Republic, wanted to decorate the walls with enormous murals, celebrating famous Florentine military victories. Leonardo was commissioned to paint one, depicting the Battle of Anghiari, a victory Florence had won decades earlier. And the city commissioned a second mural, on the facing or adjacent wall, depicting a different battle, from a much younger artist who was rapidly becoming a sensation. That artist was Michelangelo Buonarroti. The two men did not like each other. Michelangelo was more than 20 years younger, intense, devout, solitary, and famously difficult. He was at that moment finishing his colossal marble statue of David, which would make him immortal. Leonardo was older, elegant, sociable, skeptical, and famous for not finishing things. They were opposites in temperament and in their view of art. Michelangelo thought sculpture was the highest art, and that painting was lesser. Leonardo argued the reverse, defending painting as the supreme discipline because it could capture everything: visible, light, color, atmosphere, and the infinite variety of nature, all at once. There are recorded instances of the two men trading barbs in the street. Michelangelo apparently mocked Leonardo over the failure of the Sforza horse, throwing in his face that he had designed a great bronze horse and never been able to cast it. It was a cruel and accurate jab. For a brief moment, the two greatest artists who ever lived were set to paint facing walls of the same room, in direct competition. It should have been the supreme event in the history of art, and it produced almost nothing. Michelangelo was called away to Rome by the Pope before he had done more than prepare his design. Leonardo got further. He worked out a tremendous, violent composition, the central knot of which showed a furious cavalry clash. Men and horses tangled together in a struggle for a battle standard, faces contorted with rage, a study of fury and chaos unlike anything before it. The preparatory drawing, the cartoon, was famous in its own day, and copies of its central group survive, including one drawn later by the painter Peter Paul Rubens, which is how we know roughly what it looked like. But when Leonardo went to put the design on the wall, he was defeated again by his own experimentation with technique. Once more, he refused to use ordinary fresco. He tried a different method, possibly involving a wax-based medium, and heating the wall to dry the paint, and it went disastrously wrong. By various accounts, the colors ran, the upper portion would not dry properly, or the wall would not take the paint as he intended. The work was damaged and abandoned, unfinished, and eventually the whole wall was painted over decades later by Giorgio Vasari with a different mural. Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari, like the Last Supper, like the Sforza horse, like the Adoration of the Magi, like so much of his life's work, exists now only as a possibility, glimpsed through preparatory drawings and the copies made by others. The competition of the century ended with both walls bare of the masterpieces they were meant to hold. There is a tantalizing footnote to this loss. For centuries, a rumor has persisted that Vasari, who revered Leonardo, could not bring himself to destroy the older master's work when he repainted the hall. Some have wondered whether Vasari built a new wall in front of Leonardo's ruined mural and painted his own scene on top, leaving the original sealed in the cavity behind, hidden but intact. In modern times, this theory drove an actual scientific investigation, with researchers probing the wall of the Great Council Hall, drilling tiny holes and inserting cameras, searching for traces of the pigments Leonardo was known to use. The results were inconclusive and controversial, and the search was eventually halted out of concern for the Vasari frescoes that would have to be damaged to go further. So the question remains open. Somewhere behind a wall in Florence, the greatest lost painting of the Renaissance may still survive in fragments, or it may be long gone. Like so much surrounding Leonardo, it sits exactly on the line between the known and the unknowable, inviting us to keep looking. Mathematics, friendship, and the search for order. It would be a mistake to imagine Leonardo as a solitary genius working entirely alone. He had pupils, companions, collaborators, and a few deep friendships that shaped his thinking, and one of the most important of these was with a mathematician, because in his middle years, Leonardo became consumed with the idea that mathematics was the key to everything. Back in Milan, before the fall, Leonardo had become close to a friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli. Pacioli was one of the foremost mathematicians of the age, the man who wrote the great summary of the mathematics of his day, and who is sometimes called the father of accounting, because he set down the system of double-entry bookkeeping that merchants used. Leonardo and Pacioli became friends, and, for a time, lived and worked in the same circle. Pacioli taught Leonardo geometry and deepened his conviction that proportion and number underlie the order of the world. Their collaboration produced a beautiful book. Pacioli wrote a treatise on proportion, called On the Divine Proportion, exploring the mathematical ratio that the ancients and the Renaissance found so pleasing, and the geometry of regular solids. And Leonardo drew the illustrations. He produced a series of drawings of geometric solids, the shapes with regular faces, rendered as if they were real objects hanging in space, some of them shown in a skeletal open-frame form so you could see through them and understand their structure. These illustrations are widely regarded as the most beautiful drawings of geometric forms ever made, and they show Leonardo turning pure mathematics into something you can almost hold in your hand. This mathematical obsession connects to one of his most famous images, the drawing known as Vitruvian Man. An ancient Roman architect named Vitruvius had written that the proportions of the ideal human body could be fitted into both a circle and a square, the two perfect geometric figures. Many Renaissance thinkers tried to draw this idea. Leonardo's version, a nude man with arms and legs outstretched, inscribed in both a circle and a square, is by far the most successful and the most famous, because he actually solved the geometric problem of how a single figure could fit both shapes by shifting the center, and because he drew the body with such anatomical truth. The image has become a universal symbol of the union of art, science, mathematics, and the human being. It hangs in the popular imagination as a kind of emblem of the whole Renaissance, and of Leonardo himself, the man who tried to find the mathematical order hidden inside the flesh. It is worth pausing on how strange the afterlife of this little drawing has been. Leonardo made it as a private study, a working sketch in one of his notebooks, never intended for public display. It is small, drawn in pen and ink, about the size of a sheet of writing paper, and yet today, it is one of the most reproduced images in the entire history of art. It appears on the back of the Italian €1 coin. It is printed on medical textbooks, on the logos of hospitals and gyms and engineering firms, on t-shirts and coffee mugs and posters in university dormitories around the world. It was etched onto a plaque and, in a later age, carried aboard spacecraft as an emblem of humanity itself. When people want a single picture to stand for the idea that the human body is beautiful, measurable, and bound up with the deep structure of the cosmos, they reach almost automatically for this figure, with his 4 arms and 4 legs, standing inside his circle and his square. Leonardo would likely have been astonished. He drew it to solve a problem, not to become a brand, but it captures so perfectly the thing he spent his life chasing, the meeting point of the seen and the calculated, that it has outgrown its origins entirely and become a kind of universal shorthand for human curiosity. The actual drawing is so fragile and so sensitive to light that the museum which owns it, the Gallery dell'Accademia in Venice, keeps it locked away in storage and brings it out for public view only on rare occasions. For a few weeks at a time, every several years, millions know the image. Almost no one has seen the real thing. He never mastered higher mathematics in the way a specialist would. His grasp of geometry was strong, but he struggled with the more abstract reaches of the subject, and he relied on friends like Pacioli to guide him. What drove him was not pure mathematics for its own sake, but the conviction that nature was written in the language of number and proportion, and that if he could understand the geometry, he could understand the world. It is the same impulse that runs through all his work, the search for the underlying pattern, the law beneath the surface, the order inside the apparent chaos of living things. We should also talk, here, about the people closest to him, because they tell us something human about a man who can otherwise seem almost too vast to know. For most of his life, Leonardo was accompanied by a young man named Gian Giacomo Caprotti, whom he nicknamed Salai, which means something like little devil or imp. Salai came into Leonardo's household as a boy of around 10 and stayed for decades. Leonardo's notebooks contain a wonderfully exasperated list of the boy's misdeeds in his first year, recording that Salai was a thief, a liar, stubborn, and a glutton, and itemizing the things he stole and the money he cost. And yet Leonardo kept him, dressed him in fine clothes, indulged him, and tolerated his behavior for the rest of his life. The relationship has been the subject of endless speculation. What is clear is that Leonardo, who never married and had no family of his own, built one out of his pupils and companions, and that he was capable of deep and lasting attachment. In his later years, another young man became central, Francesco Melzi, who was from a noble family, well-educated, devoted, and serious in a way Salai never was. Melzi became Leonardo's true heir, his secretary, his companion, and after his death, the guardian of his papers. It was Melzi who would carry the precious notebooks back to Italy and try, however imperfectly, to preserve them. Without Melzi's loyalty, even the fraction of Leonardo's work that survives might have been lost entirely. Rome, frustration, and a new pope. Around 1513, Leonardo, now in his 60s, moved to Rome. A new pope, Leo X, had been elected, a son of the Medici family of Florence, and Rome, under the Medici popes, was becoming the great center of art and patronage, the place where the most ambitious projects and the biggest money were now flowing. Leonardo went there under the protection of the Pope's brother, Giuliano de' Medici, hoping, surely, to find the kind of grand commission and steady support that had sustained him in Milan. It did not go well. Rome in these years belonged to younger men. Michelangelo had painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, an overwhelming achievement that placed him at the summit of the art world. The brilliant young painter Raphael, who deeply admired Leonardo and had learned from his innovations, was the favorite of the papal court, decorating the Pope's own apartments with serene, perfect frescoes and receiving commission after commission. Leonardo, the older master, found himself somewhat sidelined, respected but not at the center, a grand figure from an earlier generation. He was not idle, but his energies in Rome turned increasingly away from the great public commissions and toward private study. He worked on mathematics, on geometry, on his anatomical investigations, and on optics and mirrors, including grand schemes for using curved mirrors to concentrate the sun's heat. He continued his studies of water and of machines. He carried out experiments that sometimes got him into trouble. There is a record of complaints that he was dissecting bodies in a Roman hospital, which a rival reported to the authorities in a way that got the practice shut down for him, choking off his anatomical work at a hospital where he had been gaining access to corpses. There was also a long, bitter quarrel with two German craftsmen assigned to work in his Roman workshop, men who were supposed to help him build his concave burning mirrors and other devices. Leonardo complained in his notes that they were lazy, that they spied on his methods, that they went off to make their own things behind his back, and that one of them spread a rumor accusing him of dark and forbidden activities, a dangerous charge given his dissections of the dead. The episode shows the daily friction of his later life. An aging master surrounded by assistants he did not trust, his projects stalling, his methods being copied or sabotaged, his reputation vulnerable to a whispered accusation. He amused the papal court, by some accounts, with curiosities and tricks, including, in one famous anecdote, fashioning wings and horns and a beard onto a lizard to make it look like a tiny dragon, and frightening visitors with it, and inflating animal intestines until they filled a whole room. These stories, true or not, suggest a restless mind filling its time with play and small wonders when the great works had dried up. The Rome years were, on the whole, a period of frustration. Leonardo was aging, his health was beginning to trouble him, and the world had moved on to younger talents who were finishing the very kinds of monumental projects he had so often left undone. His patron Giuliano de' Medici fell ill and died. Leonardo's position in Rome grew weaker. And so, when an extraordinary offer arrived from beyond the Alps, from a young king who wanted nothing from Leonardo except his presence, the old man accepted and left Italy forever. The last paintings. In the final stretch of his life, across his second time in Milan, his years in Rome, and his move to France, Leonardo produced a small number of late paintings that are among the most refined and mysterious things he ever made. He was painting less and less, more slowly than ever, and reworking endlessly. But the few works of this period show his technique at its absolute peak, and one of them would, 5 centuries later, become the most expensive painting ever sold. One great project of his later years was a composition of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. It shows 3 generations in a single, tender, twisting group. Saint Anne, the mother of Mary, sits with the young Mary on her lap, and Mary leans forward to reach for the infant Christ, who in turn is playing with a lamb. The figures interlock in a flowing pyramid of bodies, full of gentle movement, set against one of his hazy blue mountain landscapes. He worked on it for years and produced a famous full-size preparatory drawing, a cartoon that was admired as a marvel in its own right, with the faces emerging from soft shadow in his characteristic smoky manner. The finished painting, now in the Louvre, was, like the Mona Lisa, never fully completed to his satisfaction and stayed with him. He also painted a St. John the Baptist that is one of the strangest images of his career. It shows the young saint emerging from total darkness, his body softly lit, pointing upward with one finger and smiling an ambiguous, knowing smile that is unsettlingly close to the smile of the Mona Lisa. There is almost no setting at all, just the figure glowing out of blackness. It pushes his technique of soft modeling to an extreme, and its mood is so enigmatic that people have argued about its meaning ever since. It was among the works he kept with him to the end. And then there is the Salvator Mundi, which means Savior of the world, a painting of Christ facing forward, one hand raised in blessing, the other holding a transparent crystal orb. For centuries, this painting was lost, overpainted, misattributed, and forgotten. It passed through various hands as a damaged copy by some unknown follower, worth almost nothing. Then, in the early 2000s, it was bought cheaply, cleaned, restored, and studied, and a number of scholars concluded that beneath the damage and overpaint was a genuine work by Leonardo himself, or at least largely by his hand. The attribution remains disputed, and serious experts still disagree about how much of it is truly his. But in 2017, the painting was put up for auction, and it sold for an astonishing $450 million, by far the highest price ever paid for any painting at auction. After the sale, the picture vanished from public view, its exact location and ownership the subject of rumor and speculation, which only added to its mystique. A painting that had been dismissed as a worthless copy became, almost overnight, the most valuable artwork on earth, on the strength of the possibility that Leonardo's hand had touched it. That single sale tells you how much weight his name still carries. The mere chance that a picture is his can make it worth nearly $500 million. What these late works share is a quality that is hard to put into words. They are quiet, dark, and inward. The figures glow out of shadow. The smiles are ambiguous. The settings dissolve into haze. They feel less like commissions executed for a patron and more like private meditations, painted and repainted by an old man for himself, carried from city to city, never quite finished, never quite let go. They are the work of someone who had stopped painting to satisfy others and was now painting only to satisfy a vision in his own mind that no finished surface could fully hold. France and the final years. The young king was Francis I of France. Francis was in his early 20s, energetic, cultured, ambitious, and dazzled by the art and learning of Italy, which French armies had been marching into and out of for a generation. He wanted to bring the splendor of the Italian Renaissance home to France, and he wanted, above all, the greatest living embodiment of that Renaissance at his court. So he invited Leonardo to come and live in France, under royal protection, with a generous pension, a fine house, and, crucially, no obligation to produce anything at all. Francis wanted Leonardo not as a laborer who owed him paintings, but as a living treasure, a wise man to talk to and to honor. In 1516, at the age of 64, Leonardo made the long journey across the Alps to France, bringing with him Melzi, his servant, and the precious notebooks and a few of his most treasured paintings, including the Mona Lisa, which still was not finished and never would be. The king installed him in a manor house called Clos Lucé, near the royal residence at Amboise in the Loire Valley, a beautiful region of rivers and chateaux. The two houses, the king's and Leonardo's, were even said to be connected by an underground passage, so that the young king could come and visit the old master and listen to him talk. Francis treated Leonardo with extraordinary reverence. He called him "my father." He visited him, sat with him, and, by all accounts, simply enjoyed his company and his conversation. For Leonardo, after the disappointments of Rome and a lifetime of demanding patrons and unfinished commissions, these final years were comfortable and honored. The security of a court that asked nothing of him but to be himself. He was not entirely idle. He drew up grand plans for the king, including a design for an ideal royal town and an enormous palace with an elaborate system of canals and schemes to drain marshes and improve the waterways of the region, the kind of large-scale hydraulic engineering that had fascinated him his whole life. He is credited, in some accounts, with designing a mechanical lion as a marvel for a royal celebration, a clockwork beast that could walk forward and then open its chest to reveal lilies, the symbol of French royalty. He continued to sort and study his notebooks, perhaps still dreaming of the treatises he would organize them into, and he kept near him the small panel of the smiling woman from Florence, returning to it with his brush even now. Here is the third fun fact, and it is a quiet one. In these last years, Leonardo turned increasingly to a strange and powerful series of drawings, now known as the Deluge series, visions of overwhelming storms and floods, of water and wind tearing apart the world in great spiraling cataclysms. After a lifetime of studying how water moves, the old man drew it at its most violent and apocalyptic, swirling curls of destruction that look, to modern eyes, almost like studies of turbulence or weather systems. Whatever was on his mind in those final years, he was still drawing water, still trying to capture the patterns of nature's most uncontrollable force, right to the end. His health was failing. Sometime in these years he suffered what was likely a stroke, which paralyzed his right hand. For a right-handed person this would have ended their drawing, but Leonardo, of course, was left-handed, so he could apparently still draw, though his strength was clearly diminishing. He grew weaker through the early months of 1519. On the 2nd of May, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at Clos-Lucé, at the age of 67. He had made a will the month before, careful and orderly, leaving his notebooks and drawings and instruments to his faithful pupil Melzi, dividing money and property among his servants, his half-brothers, and the loyal Salai, and arranging for masses to be said, and for a proper funeral, with a procession of priests and the poor carrying candles. There is a beautiful legend, repeated by Vasari, that Leonardo died in the very arms of King Francis, who had rushed to his bedside. The story is almost certainly not literally true, because records suggest the king was elsewhere on that day. But the fact that such a legend attached itself to Leonardo tells you how he was regarded. People wanted to believe that the greatest mind of the age had died cradled by a king, and that the king had wept for him as for a father. He was buried in a church at Amboise. In a final irony that suits his story, even his grave was not to remain undisturbed. The church where he was buried was damaged and partly demolished during the religious wars and the upheavals of later centuries, and his original tomb and remains were disturbed and lost. Bones believed to be his were later gathered and reburied in a chapel at Amboise, where a stone marks the supposed resting place of Leonardo da Vinci. But whether the bones beneath it are truly his, no one can say for certain. The man who dissected the dead to understand them could not, in the end, keep his own body settled in one place. It is a strangely fitting conclusion for someone who left almost everything unfinished and unfixed. The man himself. We have followed Leonardo through workshops, courts, battlefields, and dissecting rooms. But who was he actually like to be around? The records give us enough to sketch a real human being, and the picture that emerges is appealing, strange, and a little contradictory, which is fitting. Physically, he made an impression. Contemporaries described him as exceptionally handsome, graceful, and strong, with long hair and, in later life, a flowing beard. He was said to be physically powerful, able to bend metal with his hands, and he moved with an elegance that people remembered. He dressed with deliberate style, in bright colors and unusually cut garments, at a time when sober dress was expected of a serious man. He cared about beauty in himself, as in everything else, and he stood out in any room. He was charming and good company. He could sing and play and improvise verses. He collected jokes, riddles, and fables, some of which he wrote down, and they show a dry, sometimes absurd sense of humor. He was sociable and kept a lively household of pupils and companions. And yet, alongside the charm, there was a deep privacy and elusiveness. He guarded his inner thoughts, wrote his notes in reversed script, and rarely committed himself fully to anyone or anything in a way the outside world could see. People found him fascinating and also found him hard to pin down. One of the most telling things about him is his attitude toward living things. There is strong evidence that Leonardo was a vegetarian, which was highly unusual in his time and place, and that he refused to eat meat out of a moral objection to killing animals. A contemporary traveler, writing about people he had encountered, described a man, almost certainly Leonardo, who would not eat any creature that had blood and would not permit harm to animals. Leonardo's own notebooks contain notes condemning the eating of meat and comparing the body to a tomb for other creatures. There is a famous, often repeated story that he would buy caged birds in the market simply in order to open the cages and set them free. Whether or not that exact scene happened, it fits everything else we know. The same man who designed weapons of war for warlords could not bear to see a bird in a cage. He held, in one mind, a horror of killing and a career partly built on engines of killing. And he never seems to have resolved the contradiction. He simply lived inside it. He had his frustrations and his vanities. He resented the university-trained scholars who looked down on him as an uneducated man, and he fired back at them in his notes, insisting that his knowledge from direct experience was worth more than their knowledge from old books. He could be proud, and he could be wounded. The jabs from Michelangelo about the uncast horse clearly stung. He was, for all his serenity, a man who knew his own worth and felt it when others failed to honor it. He also seems to have struggled, all his life, with the very thing his career is now defined by, the unfinished work. Scattered through his notebooks are small, private notes that read almost like an artist scolding himself, reminders to actually complete things, to stop being distracted, to work. In one famous and poignant scribble set down among his studies, he simply asks himself whether anything was ever actually finished, whether any single thing he set out to do was ever truly completed. It is a startling thing to find in the private papers of the most gifted man of his age. He knew, he was aware, all along, of the gap between his ambitions and his output, and it troubled him. He was not blissfully scattered, floating from wonder to wonder without a care. He was a perfectionist who could not finish, and who knew he could not finish, and who carried that knowledge with him like a quiet weight. And he was, above everything else, curious in a way that never switched off. His notebooks are full of questions he set himself, often about things that had no practical use to anyone. Why is the sky blue? How does a woodpecker's tongue work? Why do people yawn? How does the heart pump blood? Why do the eyes of animals shine in the dark? What is the pattern of the swirl where a river meets a bridge pier? He wanted to know, simply to know, with no thought of profit or publication, things that no one else thought to ask. That bottomless, indiscriminate curiosity was the engine of his whole life. It is what made him scatter his energies across 100 fields, what made him leave so much unfinished, and what made him see, again and again, things that the rest of humanity would not notice for centuries. To understand Leonardo, you have to understand that for him, the question was always more interesting than the answer, and the next question more interesting still: what he left behind. Leonardo died with very little of what he had attempted brought to completion. Let us be honest about the scale of the incompletion, because it is part of the truth of him. As a painter, the number of works generally accepted as his is astonishingly small, fewer than 20 paintings, and several of those are unfinished. The bronze horse was never cast. The Battle of Anghiari peeled and was painted over. The Last Supper began to decay in his own lifetime. The grand treatises on painting, on water, on anatomy, on the flight of birds, on mechanics, were never assembled and published. The flying machines never flew. Most of the inventions were never built. By any ordinary accounting of a career, this is a record of failure on a grand scale. And yet, the handful of finished paintings include the single most famous portrait in the world and the single most famous religious painting in Western art. The few thousand surviving notebook pages, even scattered and incomplete, reveal a depth and range of understanding that no other individual of his era came close to. His anatomical drawings anticipated discoveries that took the medical world centuries to confirm. His geological reasoning about fossils and the age of the Earth was correct and far ahead of its time. His studies of optics, of water, of the flight of birds, of the mechanics of the body, were the work of a mind operating generations beyond its moment. The deepest puzzle of Leonardo is the gap between his influence on art, which was immediate and enormous, and his influence on science, which was almost non-existent until centuries later. As an artist, he changed everything. His use of sfumato, his three-quarter portraits, his dramatic and psychologically alive compositions, his mastery of light and atmosphere, all of it was absorbed by the artists who came after him, by Raphael, who studied his work closely, by the whole later tradition of Western painting. In art, he was a foundation that everyone built upon. In science, he built nothing that others could stand on, for the simple reason that he kept it to himself. He did not publish. He did not teach his methods to the wider world of learning. His discoveries stayed locked in private notebooks written backward in a hand few could read, and then those notebooks were scattered after his death. So the science had to be rediscovered, independently, by people who had no idea Leonardo had been there first. He was not a contributor to the slow collective march of scientific knowledge. He was a solitary peak, brilliant and isolated, whose light reached the rest of the world only long after it had been rediscovered from other directions. It is worth tracing, briefly, how his reputation traveled across the centuries, because the Leonardo we revere today was assembled gradually. In the generations right after his death, he was remembered above all as a painter, and as a slightly frustrating one, a supreme talent who had wasted himself on too many projects and finished too little. The art writer Giorgio Vasari, whose biography did so much to fix Leonardo's image, praised his gifts as almost divine, while shaking his head at his habit of abandoning work. For a long time, that was the story. A heavenly painter who could not be made to deliver. His scientific notebooks, scattered and unreadable, were curiosities owned by collectors, admired for their drawings but not understood as a body of knowledge. It was only from the 19th century onward, as scholars began seriously transcribing and publishing the notebooks, that the other Leonardo came into view: the anatomist, the engineer, the geologist, the student of water and flight. The 20th century, with its own faith in science and technology, fell in love with this version of him, the man who had sketched flying machines and armored vehicles and diving gear. Each age, in other words, has found in him the genius it most admired: the divine painter, then the universal scientist, then the visionary inventor. The figure has grown larger with each retelling, until he has become less a historical man than a symbol of human possibility itself. Why did he not finish, not publish, not complete. Part of it was simply that he took on too much. His curiosity was so broad that no single life could have completed a fraction of it. Part of it was his perfectionism and his restless habit of moving on to the next problem before the last was solved. Part of it was bad luck. The wars and political collapses that destroyed his patrons and his projects. Part of it was his refusal to accept the limitations of existing methods, which led him to brilliant experiments that sometimes failed catastrophically, as with the Last Supper and the Battle of Anghiari. And part of it, perhaps, was that for Leonardo the act of understanding mattered more than the act of completing. Once he had seen how something worked, once he had solved the problem in his mind and on the page, the labor of finishing the public product may have held less interest for him than the next thing he did not yet understand. He was not, in the end, a man building monuments. He was a man trying to understand the world, and understanding has no finish line. The Renaissance man. We call him the Renaissance man, and the phrase has come to mean a person of many talents, accomplished in many fields. Leonardo earns the title more completely than anyone. Painter, sculptor, architect, military engineer, anatomist, geologist, botanist, mathematician, inventor, cartographer, musician, and writer. He worked in all of these and excelled in several. But the phrase applied to him means something deeper than mere versatility. It points to a particular idea about what a human being could be. The Renaissance recovered an old confidence in human potential, a belief that a person could understand the world through observation and reason, could rival the achievements of the ancients, and could shape their own knowledge and destiny. Leonardo is the supreme example of that confidence, not because he mastered many fields, but because he refused to recognize the boundaries between them. For him, painting and anatomy and engineering and geology were not separate subjects. They were all the study of one thing, the visible world, and they all illuminated one another. The artist who wanted to paint a body had to understand its muscles. The engineer who wanted to build had to understand forces. The man who wanted to understand water saw the same swirling patterns in a river, in a head of hair, and in the chambers of the heart. He believed the world was a connected whole, governed by patterns that repeated across every scale, and he spent his life trying to read those patterns wherever they appeared. His method was the foundation of what we now call science. Even though he produced no published science, he insisted on experience over authority. When the scholars cited ancient books, Leonardo cited his own eyes. He dissected the body rather than trusting old texts about it. He observed the water rather than accepting received wisdom about it. He read the rocks rather than the scripture about the flood. Again and again, he trusted careful observation and reasoning from evidence over the inherited authority of the past, and in this he was pointing the way toward the scientific revolution that would arrive a century or more after his death. He arrived at the right attitude, the experimental, observational, questioning attitude. Without the community, the publication, and the cumulative method that would eventually make that attitude into modern science. He had the temperament of a scientist in a world that had not yet invented the institution. There is a temptation, looking back, to turn Leonardo into a flawless legend, a superhuman who could do anything. The truth is more useful and more human. He was a man who started far more than he finished, who chased too many things at once, who let great commissions slip through his fingers, who served a brutal warlord despite hating war, who could be secretive and elusive, and who died with most of his ambitions unrealized. He was not a god. He was a person of immense gifts and real limitations, driven by a curiosity so powerful that it both made his work extraordinary and prevented him from ever completing most of it. And maybe that is the most valuable thing about his story. The curiosity that made him unable to finish is the same curiosity that made him see further than anyone around him. You could not separate the two. The wandering attention that abandoned the adoration of the Magi is the same attention that filled 7,000 pages with the workings of the world. The perfectionism that ruined the Last Supper is the same perfectionism that produced the smile of the Mona Lisa. He was, completely and inseparably, both the unfinished man and the universal genius. To wish away his failures would be to wish away the very mind that produced his triumphs. 500 years later, we still gather by the millions to look at a small painting of a Florentine woman through layers of protective glass. We still build his flying machines and his bridges to see if they would have worked. We still turn the pages of his backward-written notebooks and find ideas we are only now catching up to. We still use his name as the highest compliment we can pay to a curious and capable mind. The man who finished almost nothing left behind more than almost anyone who ever lived. That is the paradox of Leonardo da Vinci, and it is why, of all the figures of his extraordinary age, he is the one we still cannot stop thinking about. He was a man without letters, a man who could not stop asking why, who looked at the world harder and more honestly than anyone of his time, and who showed, for all his unfinished work, what a single human mind is capable of seeing. That is the inheritance he left us. Not a finished cathedral of knowledge, but the example of the search itself, carried out with a depth and a freedom that still feels, half a millennium later, almost impossible. If you made it all the way to the end of this, you now understand Leonardo da Vinci better than most people who only know him as the man who painted the Mona Lisa. There is another video waiting on screen right now, and that one is next. If 2 hours on the most curious mind in history was worth your time, a like or a subscribe tells me to keep making these. Thanks for watching.